What's up? This is a piece called Anti-Zionism and the Anarchist Tradition by Eiglad. It is initially hard to see a connection between the anarchist tradition and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. On the surface, anarchism promises little explanation of this conflict over statehood and opposing national identities. Furthermore, in the world today, anarchism, or in a broad sense, quote, anti-state politics, end quote, is nowhere on the public agenda. Even if it were, there would be no obvious reasons for anarchism to be concerned with Israel and Zionism. Anti-Zionism has been shaped primarily by ideological forces that are explicitly hostile to anarchism and its anti-state aspirations. Why then is it relevant to discuss the relationship between anti-Zionism and the anarchist tradition? First of all, because the anarchist perspective spurs a whole series of ideological motivations and analyses that cannot easily be countered by conventional criticisms of anti-Zionism. Scholars of anti-Semitism today are doing an excellent job in pointing out when and where anti-Zionism turns into anti-Semitism or when it reveals itself as anti-Semitism. But there are forms of anti-Zionism that cannot easily be categorized as anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism is often, but not always, a code name for anti-Semitism. This means that unless we try to explore the underlying motivations, principles, and analyses that guide contemporary anti-Zionism, it will be difficult for us to understand it, much less challenge it. In particular, contemporary critics of anti-Semitism do not take into account what animates the anarchist critiques of Zionism and the State of Israel. In recent years, anarchist or anti-state arguments are increasingly used as a justification for anti-Zionist positions. Noam Chomsky has been a vocal and highly influential anti-Zionist since the early 1970s, but for a long time he was quite lonely in professing his anarchist sympathies. Anti-Zionists frame their struggle against Israel not in traditional anarchist terms, but in terms of Maoist, Trotskyist, or broader post-colonial analyses. After the turn of the millennium, however, anti-state arguments seem to become increasingly popular. When Chomsky's friend Norman Finkelstein is charged with being dismissive of the Israeli state, he argues that he is dismissive of all states. The lessons of the Second World War and the Holocaust, Finkelstein claims, are that we should distrust all states and that we owe loyalty to none. Judith Butler, a harsh critic of Zionism, in 2011 declared herself to be a, quote, provisional anarchist, end quote. More important, however, is that we now see new forms of resistance to Israel and Zionism emerging. For more than a decade, activist networks like the International Solidarity Movement and the Israeli-based Anarchists Against the Wall have been highly influential in shaping radical opinion in the West, and we now see anarchists flock to the Palestinian cause. This is a relatively new phenomenon. Anarchists are neither the most vocal nor the most intransigent of the anti-Zionists today, but during the last decade there has been a distinct, quote, anarchist turn, end quote, in anti-Zionist activism. The anarchist tradition provides a kind of reasoning and new set of justifications that differ fundamentally from the crude maxims of anti-imperialism and national liberation that pestered the New Left in the 1960s and 1970s. While anti-imperialist and post-colonial theories provided the New Left's ammunition against Israel, their support for national liberation struggles and for creating new states as a means of fighting imperialism and the capitalist order were arguments the anarchists always distrusted. There were exceptions, but this was still the rule. Today, anarchism is in one form or another may contribute to spreading anti-Zionist ideas to progressive circles that formerly rejected anti-Zionism. If we are to decipher the new anti-Semitisms, it is crucial to understand how these changes came about and why anti-Zionism gradually had become a staple of anarchism's anti-state and anti-capitalist creed. Anarchism may not have a huge following today, but left libertarian ideas have a broad appeal to activists in social movements such as feminism, ecology, and urban radicalism, particularly among activists who adhere to no particular ideology. But in order to properly assess how anarchism anarchism or anti-state politics relate to anti-Zionism, we first need to look briefly at how the anarchist tradition is related to anti-Semitism. Any new idea must be judged against the backdrop of historical experience, particularly when dealing with a cultural phenomenon as slippery and mutable and deadly as anti-Semitism. The dark side of anarchism. Historically, anti-Semitism came predominantly from the political right. In its modern forms, it developed in reaction to the ideas that nurtured the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Cosmopolitanism, egalitarianism, and republicanism were modern ideas that reactionary theorists associated with social turmoil and national decay and with Jacobin terror. Still, the political left was never immune to anti-Semitic ideas and sentiments, and it often shared a reservoir of images with the right. Images that played on deep-seated cultural prejudices against Jews, against Jewish exceptionalism transmitted from medieval Europe. This was also the case with anarchism. Despite their fervent anti-nationalism, anarchism's founding fathers made deeply anti-Semitic remarks. Anarchist ideology emerged in the aftermath of the French Revolution and came into its own during the 1840s. By anarchism, I refer to the radical anti-authoritarian political tradition that seeks to build a new social order not structured around states of any kind, but based on other types of human community, namely collectives, municipalities, cooperatives, and voluntary associations. The first self-identifying anarchist was the Frenchman Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. His devotion to social equality and the rights of men led him to claim that he was, quote, prepared to sacrifice his country to justice, end quote. He is not a nationalist in a conventional sense, but increasingly came to associate the, quote, sacred land of Gaul, end quote, with the revolutionary idea seeking to rid France of foreign influence. Proudhon's vicious anti-Semitism expressed in this statement from 1847 cannot be misinterpreted. Quote, the Jew is the enemy of humankind. This race must be sent back to Asia or be exterminated. By steel or by fire or by expulsion, the Jew must disappear, end quote. In Proudhon's mind, Jews were inextricably linked to usury. Although Proudhon himself probably would have denied this, his anti-Semitism seems to have been rooted far more in French traditionalism and prejudice than in anarchist ideology. The same could be said about Leo Tolstoy's disdain for Jewish religion. His anti-Judaism is best understood in light of his Christianity and the widespread prejudices that existed in the Russia of his day, not primarily in his anti-state creed. By contrast, the Russian émigré Mikhail Bakunin made anti-Semitic remarks that seem more directly derived from his anarchist analysis. In his attacks on Marx, for instance, Bakunin wrote, quote, this whole Jewish world comprising a single exploiting sect, a kind of blood-sucking people, a kind of organic destructive collective parasite, going beyond not only the frontiers of states but of political opinion. This world is now, at least for the most part, at the disposal of Marx on the one hand and of Rothschild on the other, end quote. The crucial point for Bakunin was that both Marx and the capitalists called for the strong centralization of the state and a central state bank. Wherever, quote, such a bank exists, the parasitic Jewish nation, which speculates in the labor of the people, will always find means to exist, end quote. In the early days of anarchism, the adoption of a crude anti-capitalism and anti-clericalism made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate social critique and resistance to, quote, foreign influence, end quote, notably by Jews. Given the ideological plasticity of the times as well as the, quote, broad back, end quote, of anarchist radicalism, it is difficult to estimate just how influential these ideas were, but the point is clear. Early anarchist ideology was stained by anti-Jewish prejudices. In Russia, Bakunin's legacy fed into populist anti-Semitism. Quote, they make no distinction between Jews and gentry, end quote. One Jewish Narodnik complained about his comrades. They were, quote, preaching the extermination of both, end quote. This problem was not in any way limited to anarchist circles. It was a broad populist problem that came to the fore during the wave of anti-Jewish riots and pogroms that swept southern Russia during the early 1880s. Revolutionaries did not instigate these anti-Jewish riots, but few populists were prepared to condemn the riots due to their, quote, revolutionary, end quote, mass, end quote, character. As Avram Yarmolinsky points out, they were not prepared to take a, quote, indifferent, let alone negative attitude towards a genuinely popular movement, end quote. Indeed, many populists condemned the repression of the riots more than the pogroms themselves. Some even rejoiced, quote, in the educational efforts of such occurrences. Russian radicals also found it difficult to oppose anti-Semitism because their program required that they had the masses on their side, an approach that demanded a certain level of opportunism. Quote, while the reactionaries would use Jewish blood to put out the fire of rebellion, end quote, it was noted, quote, their adversaries were not averse to using it to feed the flames, end quote. The pogroms in the Pale of Settlement led many Jews to emigrate westward to countries like France, where Proudhon's followers had not yet resolved his tainted legacy. A shift was underway, forced on them by the public debacle that followed the Alfred Dreyfus trial in 1894, which neither anarchists nor socialists took seriously at first. Prominent anarchists like Bernard Lazare and Sebastian Faure, I think that's how you say that person's name, Faure, were among the first to speak out in Dreyfus's defense, and shortly after the January 1998 publication of Émile Zola's Seismic J'accuse, anarchists organized the first public demonstration for his acquittal. I think that means it was supposed to be 1898. Although the pro-Dreyfus anarchists initially met strong opposition from many of their comrades, the Dreyfus affair would eventually force anarchists to take a definite stand on the issue of anti-Semitism. Furthermore, the Jewish immigration from East brought masses of poor artisans, proletarians, peasants, and de classe elements among the Jews. These were strata anarchists and socialists readily identified with. Another important factor in this turn was that the political right during the period of the Dreyfus affair became more explicitly anti-Semitic. By the turn of the last century, anti-Semitism had arguably become one of the ideological issues that did in fact divide the left and right. So what about anarchist practice? In contrast to Stalinism, Maoism, and social democracy, anarchism has never been victorious anywhere in the world and has never controlled large territories over any period of time. Nowadays, however, it is difficult to appreciate just how influential anarchist ideology was in the formative years of the international labor movement. In France, the failed rising in Lyon in September 1870, the defeat of the Paris Commune in 1871, and the demise of the First International in 1872, as well as the subsequent rise of anarchist individualism and terrorism, hampered the development of anarchism as a mass movement. By the outbreak of the First World War, anarchism's influence in most countries had waned. The only places anarchists had considerable impact were in the Ukraine during the Russian Civil War and in the Spanish Revolution of 1936. Despite the significance of Bakunin, Tolstoy, and Kropotkin to the development of the international anarchist movement, Russian anarchists did not form any significant movement until after the February Revolution of 1917. But although explicit anarchist groups and their influence were infinitesimal, genuinely libertarian anti-state ideas shaped early Russian socialism. Within Russian revolutionary populism, Asaya Berlin remarks, quote, violent disputes took place about means and methods, about timing, but not about ultimate purposes. Anarchism, equality, a full life for all, these were universally accepted. This broad left libertarian legacy was carried forward by the massive Socialist Revolutionary Party and eventually its offshoot, the Left Socialist Revolutionaries. In the build-up to the October Revolution, anarchist groups, collectives, and movements sprang up all over Russia, but none were more significant than the Ukrainian Makhnovshchina, a remarkable partisan army led by the anarchist Nestor Makhno, which was instrumental in defeating the white armies of Denikin and Wrangel in the Russian Civil War. The chaos and destruction of the Civil War brought tremendous violence directed against the Jews, both as spontaneous pogroms and as systematic massacres, and this was certainly also the case in the Ukrainian theater of war. Civil war not only unleashed built-up popular resentment of Jews, but forces of the White Army systematically associated Jews with the revolution. Between 1918 and 1920, it was estimated that more than 60,000 Ukrainian Jews were murdered. When the whites were defeated, Trotsky's Red Army turned against the Makhnovists. Bolshevik media denounced the Makhnovists as anti-Semites and instigators of pogroms, but the historical record instead seems to indicate that these were rumors started by the Bolsheviks to discredit anarchism in the eyes of radical Jews and diaspora communities. If you're more interested in anti-Semitism in the Russian Civil War, I'd recommend listening to some of the lectures and maybe reading the work. I've never read the work, but I've listened to his lectures by Brendan McGeever, who's, I think that's how you say his, I think that's his name, who co-hosted the series on social histories of revolution with Simon Pirani. And he's written extensively on anti-Semitism within Bolshevik units within the Russian Civil War, especially in Ukraine. And I think he says something to the effect that of all the pogroms, maybe 10% or 5 or 10% of them were Bolshevik led or were within the Bolshevik ranks and not within the White Army ranks. Most of them obviously were from the White Army, but there was a small but noticeable portion of anti-Semitic acts within the Bolshevik Red Army. Anywho, not only did Jews occupy leading positions in the Makhnovist cultural educational section as well as its military command, but many Jews also fought alongside Ukrainians and Cossacks and in separate army detachments. Furthermore, although there were at times anti-Semitic elements among his partisans, Nestor Makhno himself consistently denounced anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred. His policy towards anti-Semitic transgressors was unmistakable. They were shot on the spot. Saul Yanovsky, I thought someone told me this one time that about Makhno that anti-Semitism was really, really heavily punished by Makhno. Someone said, I was at a talk, and someone who written is I think the book's called No Innocent Power or something like that. But it was written by a young guy who was his young historian, and he was saying in his talk that Makhno shot some guy in the head for something related to anti-Semitism, just on a kind of a personal whim or something like that. And I was that's crazy, but so it's kind of weird to actually see something along those lines being stated here, especially in a book that's not catering to where the context in which I saw that lecture was in a radical bookstore. This is written in a book that's just about new anti-Semitism in general, and critics of that are not exclusively radical leftists like Eiglad. Oh yeah, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, that this guy, if you don't know who he is, he's a big social ecology guy from Norway, who was affiliated or ran himself New Compass Press, which released a lot of helpful articles that I have on the YouTube channel. So yeah, anyway, Saul Janowski, the editor of Freie Arbeiterstimme, a major Yiddish news, a major Yiddish journal in New York, accused Mokhnavism of being an anti-Semitic movement, but he later acknowledged that he had been wrong on this point. Spain is the only country in the modern era where anarchism can credibly be said to have developed into a major social movement and to have seriously threatened the state. In contrast to what most other countries on the continent experienced, classical anti-Semitism never gained the same foothold in the Spanish left, certainly not among the major anarchist and syndicalist tendencies. It is not hard to understand why. Not only had Spain essentially been a country without Jews since the Reconquista of 1492, but anti-Semitism was always fundamentally identified with the political right and the forces of clerical reaction. To the Carlist and Franco-Phalangists, the Republican forces, and certainly the militantly anti-clerical anarchists, embodied the fateful triad of Freemasons, Communists, and Jews. Spanish anarchism was spearheaded by the large anarcho-syndicalist trade union Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, CNT, National Confederation of Labor, which claimed a membership of 1.4 million workers. Having defended the Spanish Republic in July 1936 against the rebellion of the army generals, they then initiated a full-fledged revolution over large areas of Republican-held Spain, championing proletarian internationalism against the nationalist forces of Franco. But even the CNT at times displayed a troublesome nationalism that prominent foreign anarchists in Spain at that time, among them Alexander M. Shapiro and Helmut Rudiger, found problematic. They sharply condemned the, quote, panegyric of revolutionary nationalism, end quote, and warned their comrades against a Spanish chauvinism they claimed had nothing to do with anarchism and proletarian universalism. The CNT, explains Michael Seidman, was furthermore, quote, not exempt from a xenophobia that occasionally degenerated into a rather familiar anti-Semitism, end quote. In January 1937, at the height of the revolution, Solidaridad Obrera, a major CNT organ, accused Franco of looking like a Jew and condemned, quote, Jewish plutocrats, end quote, and financiers of collaborating with Hitler. More shamefully, in May 1938, a Sephardic Jew named Ben Cremo asked the CNT to aid persecuted Jews who fled Central Europe, but he received only a cold response from Mariano Vasquez, the secretary of its national committee. Vasquez expressly refused to open Spain's doors, quote, to all the Jews who wish to come here. It is impossible because it would undoubtedly be one of the most counter-revolutionary decisions that we could take, end quote. Vasquez's reasoning is telling. He was certain that admission of the Jews, quote, would mean the immediate revival and strengthening of capitalism and the old exploitation, end quote. Such occurrences to the contrary, the Spanish anarchists were perhaps the most class-conscious, idealistic, and internationalist proletariat the European left had ever produced. Sorry, I had to copy that. One second. Sorry, 1 second. Excuse me. The black banners of anarchism not only symbolize fierce resistance to capitalism, but a fundamental rejection of all nations and all states. In its formative years, a crudely formulated hatred of capitalism fed on the popular images of Jews as, quote, unproductive and, quote, parasitical foreign elements. But when anarchism developed into a somewhat systematic set of ideas, anti-Semitism never became an integral part of its analysis or ideology. For years on, however, a, quote, anarchism of fools, end quote, persisted, and when ideologically grounded, it seems mainly influenced by Proudhon. In 1911, seeking to marry the revolutionary ideas of Georges Sorel with French integralism and anti-Semitism, syndicalist theorist Georges Valois and Edouard Berthe formed the Cercle Proudhon in France, where the group's influence provided continuous links between revolutionary syndicalism and fascism up to the days of the Vichy regime. Historian Zeev Sternhell Zeev Sternhell, also traces how the ideology of the Cercle Proudhon would prefigure key ideological components of Italian fascism. But as noted earlier, after the Dreyfus Affair toward the end of the 1890s, these ideas were relegated to the margins of anarchism. Indeed, many of these individuals would soon find a more comfortable home on the political right and ultimately in rising fascist movements. In general, then, from the turn of the last century, anarchism had developed a relatively consistent anti-nationalist and anti-statist position that condemned anti-Semitism as a poison for working-class internationalism. In order to make a proper assessment of anti-Zionism and the anarchist tradition, however, it's not sufficient to look at the dark side of anarchism. We must look also at its brighter side, not the least on the influence of anarchism on Jewish political movements and within Jewish communities. The truth is that there not only was a Spanish anarchism, a Russian anarchism, and a French anarchism, but also a very important tradition of Jewish anarchism. Jewish anarchism. Jews played a central role in all the revolutionary movements that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. In Russia, the Jewish Bund played an influential role, and in all diaspora communities, Jews took major part in socialist and anarchist organizations. Furthermore, anarchism played an important role in fostering a Yiddish culture in both Europe and the United States. This did not contradict anarchist ideals of equality and human solidarity. As historian Paul Avrich says, anarchists, quote, cherishing diversity against standardization and conformity, have always prized the difference among peoples, cultural, linguistic, historical, quite as much as their common bonds, end quote. Anarchist universalism and anti-nationalism was not simply calling for assimilation into the dominant culture, but about creating an alternative working-class culture that would encourage both cultural autonomy and universalism. When the German anarchist Rudolf Rocker went into exile in 1892, he was introduced to Jewish anarchism in Paris. And although he initially thought the very idea of a specifically Jewish anarchism sounded like a travesty, he was completely taken by Jewish anarchist egalitarianism, hospitality, and trust in debate. 3 years later, Rocker moved on to England, where he quickly began to learn Yiddish to be able to address and take part in the Jewish radical communities in London's East End. During the heyday of Britain's anarchist movement, the Jewish community was considered to be the largest anarchist group in the country. Rocker soon became the editor of Arbeiter Freund, the major Yiddish anarchist newspaper in Britain, and wrote a series of books and pamphlets in Yiddish. He was highly esteemed in the Jewish community, and to quote an East End Jew, he was, quote, their rabbi, end quote. The anarchist influence on early Jewish radicalism was considerable, but this exchange of ideas went both ways. Jewish influences on anarchism were not in any way less significant because of the many Jewish luminaries of the international anarchist movement, such as Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Bernard Lazare, Volin, and Gustav Landauer. Gustav Landauer, a towering figure in German anarchism, was to carry this legacy to Israel, most notably through Martin Buber, who was not only a personal friend of Landauer, but the editor who brought his works to international attention. Anarchism also shaped the theological politics of prominent Kabbalist Gershom Scholem. Other pioneers, such as A.D. Gordon, also gave a distinct anarchist coloring to Habul Hatzer and the early kibbutzim. It is commonly asserted that anarchism was a major political contender only in Spain and the Ukraine, and only for a short time, but an argument can be made that early Jewish settlements in Palestine were a vibrant example of anti-state socialism. James Horrocks, Horrox for one, has brought new attention to the influence of anarchism in the kibbutz movement, but even general accounts of the kibbutzim convey the distinct libertarian character of their collectivism. To illustrate how significant anarchist ideas were for early Zionism, Horrocks refers to a fascinating correspondence between Nachum Goldman, then the leader of the German Socialist Zionist Organization and later president of the World Zionist Organization, and Landauer. Goldman asked Landauer for advice on how to implement exactly the kind of, quote, decentralized community system, end quote, that Landauer had advocated, particularly in relation to the integration of industry and larger federalist structures. The points Goldman raised in his correspondence reflect how closely his plans for the kibbutzim related to Landauer's future anarchist order. However, in May 1914, before Landauer could address these issues in full, he was seized by a mob of soldiers for his involvement in the Bavarian Socialist Republic and beaten to death. But his ideas, as well as those of Peter Kropotkin, were to shape early kibbutzim's social, economic, and ethical aspirations and practices in the 1920s and 30s. According to Avram Yasur, during the first decades of its existence, Hashomer Hatzer, a network of kvutza and kibbutzim, quote, dreamt of creating a state that was not a state, but rather a large confederation of communes, end quote. To quote from the memoirs of Scholem, quote, the social and moral perception of anarchists like Tolstoy and Landauer was of inestimable importance in the building of new life in Eretz Israel, end quote. Is Meir Yari, Meiryari, one of the early leaders of the organization, stated in 1940, Hashomer Hatzer road to the kibbutz was anarchistic. This was not, end quote. This was not lost on the anarchist movement. A 1962 article in the British anarchist journal Freedom stated that the kibbutz, quote, is one of the best examples of democracy and certainly the nearest thing to practicing anarchism that exists, end quote. James Horrocks reminds us that anarchism strives to go beyond theory and begin to, quote, build the elements of the new society in the present, end quote. He concludes his study with the observation that, quote, the kibbutz movement and the various forms of autonomous and quasi-autonomous communal organization that existed throughout pre-1948 Palestine represent probably the single most exemplary historical instance of such constructive activism in action, end quote. Anarchism, Zionism, and Israel. But what is anarchism's relationship to Zionism and the establishment of Israel? In general, anarchists were highly positive towards Zionist settlements in Palestine, though with some modifications. Landauer and many other Jewish anarchists were sympathetic to the settlements and to the project of establishing a new Jewish culture in the land of Palestine, but skeptical about, quote, political Zionism, end quote, the attempts to forge a new Jewish state. They were more interested in the Zionist project as the creation of utopian social alternatives and a new society, untainted by traditions of state nationalism or capitalism. This was a notion that Martin Buber shared, despite his recognition of the need for a state preferably as a, quote, community of its communities, end quote, and he pressed for a cultural Zionism, for the need to foster a visionary collectivism, and for a federalist relationship to the Jews' Arab neighbors. This led many early Zionists to reject nationalism and aspirations to create a distinct Jewish state. They were probably more comfortable with Balfour's opaquely worded declaration of support for the, quote, establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote. It is also true that anarchists like Emma Goldman were critical of nationalism and aspirations for state building, but not of Jewish settlements working the land and developing a distinct Jewish culture. She admitted opposing, quote, Zionism as the dream of capitalist Jewry of the world for a Jewish state with all its trimmings, such as government laws, police, militarism, and the rest, end quote. She did not want a Jewish state machinery. This was a commitment widely shared by Zionist settlers during the second and third Aliyah. They certainly did not want to impose themselves as a new ruling class in Palestine. In fact, that is precisely why the early kibbutza and kibbutzim took the radical egalitarian form they did. The land, they believed, should belong to those who tilled it, and only a radical egalitarianism could ensure the building of a new social order among the Jewish settlers. In A.D. Gordon's view, quote, emigration to Palestine without radically revolutionizing Jewish social structures is nothing else than a transference of exile to the land of Israel, end quote. Furthermore, criticisms of Zionism were not in any way limited to a particular, Furthermore, criticisms of Zionism were not in any way limited to a principled anarchist anti-nationalism. Before the Second World War, the Bundists of Poland and Russia forcefully opposed political Zionism. They saw it as a form of, quote, escapism, end quote, from the real challenge, namely to achieve certain degrees of territorial and cultural autonomy within other nation-states. Zionism was also opposed by most European social democrats who preferred assimilation into socialist parties and cultures. But the Jewish settlements could not mature in peace. Quote, the doctrine of proletarian internationalism clashed with the cruel facts of life, end quote. Walter Lecour points out, quote, as the young generation became aware of the vital importance of defense for which they ideologically had been quite unprepared, end quote. Not only were their settlements attacked in 1929 and again in 1936 to 1939, but the onslaught of Hitler's armies and their annihilation of European Jewry meant that settlements in Palestine had to consolidate themselves to be able to guarantee Jewish survival and security. After the experience of European Nazism and the Holocaust, many radicals accepted the establishment of Israel as a necessary historical fact, and erstwhile political differences cooled down in comparison to the heated interwar debates. Jews were traumatized, as Colin Schindler asserts, both by the, quote, inability of the civilized world to save them, end quote, as well as by the fact that, quote, the international proletariat did not rise up against their masters, end quote. This recognition created an existential gap that, in his view, essentially, quote, divided the Jewish left from the European left, end quote. This rift also haunted the anarchists, who faced yet another existential crisis. After the crushing of Spanish anarcho-syndicalism in the late 1930s, anarchists in Europe who never believed in bourgeois republic, social democracy, Hitler, or Stalin no longer had any viable social alternatives to point to. Mark Mrachny, the editor of Freie Arbeiterstimme, the Yiddish paper, during the 1930s expressed the defeat of Spain as a crushing disappointment. After that, quote, he felt like a rabbi in an empty synagogue, end quote. Furthermore, it was clear that radical hopes for combating anti-Semitism without a new state formation had failed. Not only were anarchism itself and its constructive social solutions historically defeated, but assimilation policy in Central Europe had obviously and disastrously failed, and so too had Bundist and socialist demands for cultural autonomy within Eastern European nations. As Colin Schindler points out, quote, the Allies may have won the war, but the Jews certainly lost it, end quote. Confronted with the Shoah, Jewish survivors and exiles of all persuasions massively shifted towards supporting the establishment of a Jewish state. There were anarchists who spoke up about the just cause of Israel's establishment and its just war of independence, but the discussions within the anarchist movement were heated and understandably painful. For the most part, anarchists did not actively support Israel, but as Mina Grohr points out, despite the fact that journals like Freie Arbeiterstimme continued to publish articles that on theoretical grounds challenged the existence of a Jewish state, quote, the state of Israel was accepted to be a historically necessary solution to the Jewish question, end quote. There were anarchists and veterans from the Spanish Civil War who left to fight for and live in Israel, but in general the dwindling number of anarchists did not have to come out publicly in support of a Jewish state. Neither did they have to play a tactical game in the emerging Cold War configuration that shaped the political far left after the Second World War. And, unlike Maoists and Trotskyists, anarchists did not automatically justify or support national liberation struggles against, quote, Western imperialism, end quote. Anarchists may not have seen any anarchist content in the establishment of the Israeli state, however sympathetic they were to the kibbutzim and labor Zionism, but they responded to the establishment of Israel with what I interpret to be a respectful silence. Anti-state socialism did not play a defining role in shaping the development of anti-Zionism in the West. We must remember that from 1948 until very recently, all resistance to Israel and to Zionism was based on the claim that it was, quote, an unnatural state, end quote, a colonizer of Arab land, and an imperialist bridgehead in the Middle East. Those who advanced anti-Zionism, it must be noted, did not object either nationalism or state formation. Their problem was Jewish nationalism and the Israeli state. Today, most anarchists have adopted an anti-Zionist stance. Actually, I'm going to take a break for a second. I'll be back, kids. Today, most anarchists have adopted an anti-Zionist stance. How is this at all possible? When did this happen? The perspectives of the anarchist movement did not change in 1948, when populations in Arab states cemented their antipathies toward, quote, the Jewish entity, end quote, in their midst. Neither did they change in 1967 after the Six-Day War, when anti-Zionism came to predominate in the Maoist, Trotskyist, and Stalinist left. Neither did it change in 1982 after the Lebanon War, which for the first time after the Second World War saw major shifts in public opinion in Western European countries, and was also the moment when many social democrats started questioning their support for Israel. Anarchists only started publicly shifting their opinions after 1987 when the first Intifada broke out in the West Bank and Gaza. Why? Because for the first time it was not a war of Arab nations against the Israeli nation, but a popular revolt that pitted a civilian population against a military apparatus. This first Intifada was a popular insurrection of, quote, stones, end quote, to use the anarchist Alfredo M. Bonanno's description. Since the student movements of the 1960s, the quintessential image of the anarchist rebel is the lone youth. The quintessential image of the anarchist rebel is the lone youth, with a stone in his hand, ready to throw it at police forces. Now the twisted image of David and Goliath was available to the new generations of activists, stone-throwing youths versus the Merkava. To be sure, anarchism did play a role in the New Left, but I do not think that it played any role in shaping anti-imperialist theories that would nurture anti-Zionism. Gradually, anarchists would, without much theorizing or historical analysis, adopt the view that Israel was a particularly illegitimate or unnatural state. By now, anarchists readily accepted that Israel is fundamentally racist, colonialist, imperialist, capitalist, and militarist, and that it is an apartheid state. Unfortunately, these claims are all too common. Not only are they held by anarchists, but they constitute integral elements of the common myths and rituals shared by the left in our time. But something new has happened. Previously, anarchists followed the anti-imperialist analysis of the Stalinist and Maoist left. Recently, they developed their own peculiar brand of anti-Zionism, a process spearheaded by Israeli and Jewish activists. The International Solidarity Movement, this is the one Rachel Corrie and Tom Herndal belong to, is a Palestinian-led nonviolent consensus-based network that gained much attention in the early 2000s. Even more interesting is the Israeli group called Anarchists Against the Wall. They aim to do their part in breaking down the fences and borders and ultimately all nation-states, and they do so by engaging in nonviolent protests on the West Bank and within Israel. The actions of these groups resonate with broad sectors among progressive movements in Europe and in the United States. Of course, they display a naivete that would be unthinkable for the anarchists who fought the White and Red armies in Russia and the Ukraine, and who fought fascists in the streets of London and Vienna, in Asturias and Barcelona. But their actions today have a broad appeal to leftists who are not beguiled by the uncritical anti-imperialist support for national liberation struggles, for reactionary religious movements, and for open anti-Semitism. They speak to activists who are genuinely against nation-states, borders, and social privileges. How important are groups like Anarchists Against the Wall? In numbers and activities, they are not at all significant, but as a moral factor, and as an example of, quote, righteous Jews, end quote, who defy their national government to simply, quote, do the right thing, end quote, which is to protest the Israeli army and to socialize with Palestinians, they are in a position to delegitimize the state of Israel in a way that it seems to me that New Left anti-imperialism no longer can. Their position can be seen as comparable to that of Max Pen in the 1960s. In Israel, Max Pen was a minuscule group of Trotskyists who defined their views simply as, quote, anti-capitalist and anti-Zionist, end quote. They had no influence in Israeli society, but several of their leaders, such as Akiva Or, Akivaorr, emigrated to Europe, and their views became hugely popular among the New Left. Here were Israelis who confirmed all the prejudices and, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, analyses espoused by the New Left. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the famous German student leader said, quote, "Matt's pen is the honor of Israel," end quote. It seems to me that the same is about to happen with new Israeli anarchist groups. I must emphasize the immensity of the ideological shift that we are witnessing. A series of new coalitions like Ship to Gaza, Israeli Apartheid Week, the boycotts, divestment and sanctions campaigns, and the like understand the need for broad public appeal. These initiatives cannot, I believe, present their views in the, quote, classical, end quote, anti-Zionist garb that appealed to the Stalinist, Maoists, and Trotskyists of the New Left in the 1960s and 1970s. To be sure, the same ideological framework still undergirds much of today's anti-Zionist activism, but when this is revealed, it damages the public image and the potential for broad mobilizations. Ironically, then, although anarchism does not have a broad appeal in Europe today, a new quasi-anarchistic rhetoric does, one that calls for joint actions and grassroots solidarity and that is clearly skeptical or negative to all states, all borders, and all kinds of nationalisms and racism, as well as every other form of oppression and violence. Groups like Anarchists Against the Wall are very useful to sustain the image of a humanitarian and progressive anti-Zionism. Their anarchist perspectives inform an anti-Zionism that is unlike any anti-Zionism we have encountered earlier. It is therefore difficult to counter anarchists' actions by using the same arguments that discredit other forms of anti-Zionist anti-imperialism or pro-Palestinian nationalism. Jews against ghettos. We should not, however, write off Anarchists Against the Wall as being just a stratagem for winning over public opinion. Uri Gordon, the most prominent representative of this organization, considers the experiences of Anarchists Against the Wall as a prime form of new anti-authoritarian politics. So what is their theory and practice? The writings of Anarchists Against the Wall shed no light. Quote, "For better or worse, Anarchists Against the Wall is a pragmatic action initiative with no ideological platform, no manifesto, and no program for the future of the region." End quote. Its criticisms are clear enough. It is against, quote, "ethnic cleansing," end quote, "apartheid," and call for the removal of, quote, "national partitions," end quote, and above all, resistance to the, quote, "military forces that cause mutual destruction and continuous slaughter," end quote. So far, there is nothing unique about this, quote, analysis. It fits well with the anti-Israeli perspectives that unite Maoists and anarchists with Christians and Islamists in anti-Israel protests all over the world. Anarchist Against the Wall does, however, claim to be against all states, nations, and borders, as are other anarchists. But then again, this amounts to little, as Anarchist Against the Wall is not concerned with ideology. Quote, "Our primary moral duty is not to maintain ideological purity, but rather to stand with Palestinians in their resistance to oppression," end quote, its activists emphasize. Anarchists Against the Wall maintains that they, the Israeli anarchists, quote, "are not equal partners, but rather occupiers who join the occupied in their struggle," end quote. The Palestinian struggle, they insist, is entirely legitimate with or without their participation, but they do have two principles. Quote, "The first principle is that although the struggle is joint, Palestinians are affected more by the decisions taken within it, and therefore the ones who should make the important decisions. Second, Israelis have a special responsibility to respect Palestinian self-determination, including respecting social customs and keeping out of internal Palestinian politics," end quote. Quote, end quote. Quote, "When I can encounter Palestinian nationalism or chauvinism," end quote, says Anarchists Against the Wall activist Roy Wagner, quote, "It's easy for me to set it aside by telling myself that my solidarity is with their place as victims of occupation, and that I, an occupier or participant in the violence that enables much of this nationalism and chauvinism, can't cast judgment," end quote. Wagner's place is simply to express solidarity with the Palestinians who, quote, must struggle on their own terms, end quote. This, he believes, is how they can build the scaffolding for a better life, quote, beyond the occupation, end quote. Queer activist Yossi Bartal agrees, quote, the struggle to change and challenge Palestinian culture with its patriarchal, militarist, and homophobic elements is not our task, but instead that of our Palestinian comrades to whom we must offer our solidarity, end quote. According to Bartal, this can be done, quote, first and foremost by lifting the weight of the occupation from their shoulders, and by fighting the same elements in our own society. Liberation is always a process, and it can evolve and intensify only by removing the biggest obstacle that stands in its way, end quote. Kobe Snitz concludes that, quote, the joint struggle faces only one main problem, the Israeli state, end quote. By engaging as far as I can understand, that means to be merely present. In joint meetings and demonstrations, anarchist activists claim to be, quote, deconstructing the racist foundations of the conflict, end quote. It is precisely this willingness to deploy, quote, the body as an instrument of resistance, end quote, that makes Judith Butler so impressed, quote, with Anarchists Against the Wall and other actions against the wall as at Berlin, which continue to divert the military and have solicited great support from global networks, end quote. The anarchism that interests Butler, quote, has to do with contesting the, quote, legal, end quote, dimensions of state power and posing disturbing challenges about state legitimacy, end quote. The point, she explains, quote, is not to achieve anarchism as a state or as a final form for the political organization of society, end quote. Its value lies simply in its, quote, disorganizing effect, end quote. The anarchists, quote, are there in solidarity pure and simple. We are there supporting the anti-occupation movement. We do not set the agenda, end quote. But what does Anarchists Against the Wall mean by, quote, occupation, end quote? It certainly, quote, doesn't stop at the checkpoint, end quote, says Bartal. Quote, it is all around us, and thus there is no, quote, here and, quote, there. Israel is the occupation, end quote. Activists from Anarchists Against the Wall are present in meetings, demonstrations, and media to build trust and to support Palestinian self-determination. As the activist Ilan Shalit puts it, quote, success has been so great that even the leaders of Hamas in the West Bank supported our participating in the joint struggles with the local popular committee of the villages, end quote. If they have, quote, no ideological platform, no manifesto, and no program for the future of the region, end quote, and if they only commit themselves to, quote, show solidarity with Palestinians, end quote, and pledge to respect all, quote, social customs, end quote, and, quote, keeping out of internal Palestinian politics, end quote, why should Hamas care if these anti-Zionists are, quote, Jewish anarchist atheists, end quote? Hamas, on the other hand, certainly do have a charter and a plan for the future of the region. When the group was initiated, they wanted a provocative name and ended up with Anarchists Against the Wall. We, quote, don't all consider ourselves as anarchists, but all agree on an anarchist way of working, says Uri Ayalon. Since ideology is not important to them, they also sometimes call themselves Jews Against Ghettos. Provocative? Indeed. But then again, they agree with the anarchist Bonanno, who claimed the situation in the occupied territories is, quote, like seeing an exact replica of the Warsaw Ghetto, end quote. In 2013, Anarchists Against the Wall presented themselves to an English audience, and they honored Bonanno by asking him to write the foreword to the group's book. Bonanno immediately urged activists to take the next step, a, quote, attack on the concrete targets that establish, nurture, guarantee, justify, and finance the management of such a monstrosity as the wall in question, end quote. Is he thinking of huge popular actions, bringing people into the streets, fraternizing between Jews and Palestinians? He answers, quote, yes, possibly that too, but also something else besides, end quote. Bonanno insists, quote, we have to attack. Everything else is just a form of support, essential but not of vital importance, end quote. It's kind of a weird phrase to call something essential but not of vital importance. Side note by myself. So who is Alfredo M. Bonanno? He is a veteran of Italian. He's a veteran Italian. What am I calling him? Italian iconoclast. Who has been. What am I, my fucking grandfather? He is a veteran Italian iconoclast who has been the main ideologue of, quote, insurrectionalism, end quote, a marginal but highly romanticized trend within contemporary anarchism. Coming from the violent class struggles in 1960s Italy, Bonanno calls for armed confrontation, propaganda of the deed, and immediate liberation. In his own book, Armed Joy, Bonanno encourages wanton murders of policemen, judges, bosses, and the wealthy. The Italian Supreme Court ordered his book retracted from libraries and destroyed, and he was incarcerated for 18 months. He has also been convicted several times for armed robberies in Italy and Greece. This is all justified according to his anarchist convictions, championing illegalism and armed insurrection. In other writings, Bonanno offers his perspective on Arab-Israeli conflict. As far as Bonanno is concerned, the situation is simple. Quote, there is a state, Israel, aggressive and militarist like many others, but which wants to kill a whole people, the Palestinian one, end quote. The Israelis, through Zionism and through the international lobbies, quote, accepted their role as gendarme of the Western project of world domination, end quote. World dominion, end quote. Bonanno says, echoing the crude anti-imperialist analyses of the Maoist left, this quote leads to an extremism hitherto unequaled in the whole of political religious history, end quote. Emphasis added. In this extremism, Bonanno claims that, quote, rekindled anti-Semitism at world level, end quote. During the first Intifada, when a bookstore in Turin was attacked by Molotov cocktails by a renegade anarchist group, the anarchist groups of the city came out in defense of the bookstore and protested such vile acts of, quote, anti-Semitism and intolerance which anarchists have always fought, end quote. Bonanno ridiculed these statements in support of a pro-Israel bookstore and defended the arsonist. Quote, we know perfectly well that the struggle against the excessive power of Israel and its project to exterminate the Palestinian people, end quote, not only takes place, quote, in that far-off land, end quote. Fascists dominate the Israeli state, he claimed, and further, quote, whoever defends the interests of the Israeli state at the present time should be attacked, end quote. Sarah Ausselin from Anarchists Against the Wall agrees that, quote, Israeli fascism is a runaway train, end quote, and that Israeli citizens are the ones to blame. They, quote, are the ones who do not revolt against racism, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing. In fact, all these are no more than a crystallization of Israeli public opinion, end quote. Israeli children are brainwashed from birth, Ausselin explains, quote, to believe that Israel must be a Jewish state, Palestinians are the enemy, and military service is a sacred duty, end quote. Since the Jews suffered the Nazi extermination project, then, quote, by definition they deserve our sympathy, end quote, Bonanno claims, although, quote, the mental rigidity of the Jews, end quote, has often, quote, put our sympathies to the test, end quote. They are driven by an ideology of pessimism derived, quote, from the millenarian isolation of the Jews and the persecution they have suffered, end quote, which, quote, makes the politics of the Israeli state extremist and irresponsible. It makes the Israeli state itself even more dangerous than any other, end quote. But this claim is not anti-Semitism, he assures us, since, quote, it is not a question of the Jews, but of the state of Israel, and naturally those of its subjects who are lending themselves to the extermination of the Palestinian people that is taking place, end quote. Bonanno is adamantly clear when he states, quote, that the enemy number one, the main obstacle to overcome, is today the state of Israel, end quote. When confronted by the brutal methods with which Palestinians were killing alleged collaborators, even by hacking them to pieces with axes, Bonanno admits that these were, quote, drastic measures to be sure, but which give an idea of what these people are suffering. When you get to certain levels, even feelings of pity and humanity begin to disappear, end quote. This, however, is not what Anarchists Against the Wall is about. Quote, now the Israeli and international anarchists take only non-violent action in Palestine, end quote. Uri Gordon emphasizes at the same time, however, both the ISM, International Solidarity Movement, and anarchists AAtW, Anarchists Against the Wall, quote, recognize the legitimacy of Palestinian armed resistance, end quote. For Gordon, this, quote, endorsement of a, quote, diversity of tactics, end quote, places anarchists in a more comfortable position in the landscape of struggle in Israel/Palestine than it would strict pacifists, end quote. But most important, perhaps, is that, quote, nonviolence has the further goal of giving visibility to the nonviolent aspects of the Palestinian struggle with which Western audiences can more easily identify, end quote. Still, the ideal solution for anarchists, quote, would be the generalized insurrection, end quote. By that, Bonanno means, quote, an intifada starting from the Israeli people that is capable of destroying the institutions that govern them and of proposing peace based on collaboration and mutual respect to the Palestinian people directly without intermediaries, end quote. But for the time being, he adds, quote, this perspective is only a dream. We must prepare for the worst, end quote. Bonanno later represents Israelis with an ultimatum, end quote. Quote, either the theocentric Israeli state disappears, giving life to another federalist kind of formation that is open to the possibility of a communitarian cohabitation with the Arab Palestinians and eventually with other peoples, end quote. He warns, or else, quote, the Jews will be moving towards a catastrophe once again, but perhaps the Shoah is precisely what they are waiting for according to the forecasts of their prophets. How can you disavow them? End quote. Jesus Christ. The struggle against anti-Zionism today. The Jewish anarchists of old are gone. So too are the anarchist mass movements that confronted fascism in Spain, challenged the Bolsheviks in Russia, and helped create the first kibbutzim. The old left they belonged to was unable to stem the rise of Nazism, and they were overwhelmed by the horrors of the Second World War and the near-complete annihilation of the European Jews. When the Nazis were finally defeated in 1945, the international anarchist movement was spiritually broken. Today, our world again faces a widespread upsurge of anti-Semitism, but an even more sinister trend is the diffusion and development of anti-Zionism, which I fear has far more explosive potential for cultivating a culture of indifference to the fate of Israel and the Jews today. Unlike classical anti-Semitism, present anti-Zionism is predominantly a leftist phenomenon. Left-wing political tendencies have shaped the main tenets of today's anti-Zionist ideology. its imagery, prejudices, and hatred, although this ideology certainly cannot be seen as disconnected from the broader trajectories of anti-Semitism. From the 1960s onward, Maoist, anti-imperialist, and Stalinist Cold War calculations did enormous damage in poisoning the aspirations of the New Left and of public discourse around Israel. I fear anarchism can play an even more destructive role delegitimizing Israel in the decades to come. Therefore, to counter today's anti-Jewish politics, we need to decipher anti-Zionism as anti-Zionism, not simply as a form of anti-Semitism, and understand its peculiarities and various mutations, of which various contemporary anarchist interpretations only form one part. Here it is crucial to acknowledge that anti-Zionism is not merely prejudice or hatred, but a set of ideas and aspirations. It has, to use Saul Friedlander's term, a, quote, redemptive dimension, end quote. This, I believe, is crucial precisely because the greatest dangers of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism lie in their promises of liberation, not in how they embody legacies of hatred and prejudice. Such an inquiry would not interest Bonanno. He believes that in the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, quote, the only reality we can turn our attention to and support is that of hundreds of young people who are resisting the Israeli tanks that occupy their land by throwing stones, end quote. That this is a crude and simplistic image does not trouble Bonanno. He insists that there is, quote, a time when Minerva's bird must go to sleep, and that is the time for action and the destruction of the enemy, end quote. Unfortunately, however, the owl of Minerva is still awake and can help orient us in the dark. The last century showed how easily pandering to passions for unbridled activism and violence could be translated into destruction and total war. Sorel brought Bakunin uncomfortably close to Ernst Jünger. We also know that when political parties say that they are out to exterminate the Jews or annihilate, quote, the Zionist entity, end quote, they probably mean it. Today we know that even Auschwitz is possible. As Imre Kertész succinctly pointed out, until Auschwitz occurred, it was not even a possibility. But it did happen, so now it is. Quote, since Auschwitz, nothing has happened that makes a new Auschwitz impossible, end quote. Gerhard explains, quote, on the contrary, because Auschwitz in fact occurred, it has now been established in our imaginations as a firm possibility. What we are able to imagine, especially because it once was, can be again. End quote. The anarchist tradition has a proud history of combating anti-Semitism, but ultimately it failed to protect the Jews, as did socialist internationalism and Republican assimilation. Those of us who are convinced that capitalism is a bad idea, who aspire for something better than the nation state, and who still dream of the day the international will be the human race, we bear a special responsibility. We must resist the historical struggles that socialists and revisit the historical struggles that socialists and anarchists waged against anti-Semitism and learn from their failures as well as from their successes. Today we see new forms of anti-Zionism develop in the guise of anti-statism and anti-nationalism, much like earlier forms of anti-Semitism were developed in the guise of anti-clericalism and anti-capitalism. If we fail to decipher and confront anti-Zionism today, less than a century after Auschwitz, we will betray not only the victims of the Shoah, but the countless anti-fascists who gave their all to defend these ideals.